What happens when a blonde police officer's laughter echoes through a courtroom, mocking a 17-year-old black research prodigy? In a twist of fate that no one saw coming, this moment of prejudice would unravel a story that changes not just lives, but an entire system. Marcus Thompson isn't your typical teenager. While his peers chase their dreams, he's chasing something more profound, a breakthrough that could save thousands from the disease that took his father. But one evening, his world turns upside down when his groundbreaking research is mistaken for criminal evidence. In a courtroom where justice seems blind to the truth, an unexpected connection emerges. The officer's own daughter battles the very disease Marcus is trying to cure. As prejudice collides with hope, and assumption faces reality, this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about judgment, redemption, and the power of seeing beyond our biases. Subscribe now to witness this powerful journey of justice, healing, and transformation that proves sometimes the most important discoveries aren't made in laboratories, but in the human heart. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pristine windows of the Hamilton Research Center, where Marcus Thompson hunched over his microscope, carefully adjusting the fine focus. At 17, he stood out among the sea of graduate students and researchers, but his dedicated presence over the past year had made him a fixture in the lab. His dark fingers moved with practiced precision as he recorded his observations in a worn leather notebook, a gift from his father before cancer took him 2 years ago. "Still here, Marcus?" Dr. Sarah Chen's gentle voice carried across the lab. "It's almost 6. Marcus looked up, his earnest brown eyes bright with excitement. "Dr. Chen, I think I'm onto something with this modified protein sequence. The cellular response is different from what we expected." Dr. Chen smiled, remembering why she'd taken a chance on this remarkable high school student. His application for the competitive research program had stood out not just for its technical merit, but for the personal essay describing his father's battle with aggressive lymphoma. Where others saw statistics, Marcus saw hope for future patients. "Pack it up for today," she advised. "You can continue tomorrow after school." Marcus carefully stored his samples and gathered his materials. The notebook went into his backpack along with his textbooks and a half-eaten sandwich from lunch. His mother's nursing shifts meant he often forgot to eat when absorbed in his work. The spring evening was pleasant as Marcus started his walk home. The research center sat in Oakwood Heights, an affluent neighborhood where modern glass buildings stood alongside restored Victorian mansions. Marcus knew every crack in the sidewalk of his daily route, just as he knew the suspicious glances from some residents who wondered what a young black man in a hoodie was doing in their neighborhood. He'd almost reached the bus stop when the police cruiser pulled alongside him. "Stop right there." The command was sharp, authoritative. Marcus froze, his heart suddenly pounding. He'd been through this before. The key was to stay calm, speak clearly, explain yourself. He turned slowly to face Officer Sarah Bennett, her blonde hair pulled back severely from a face set in stern lines. "Good evening, officer," Marcus said carefully. "Is something wrong? We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." Officer Bennett's hand rested casually on her weapon. "What are you doing here?" "I'm walking to the bus stop. I'm a research assistant at the Hamilton Center." "A research assistant?" Officer Bennett's laugh was sharp, skeptical. "Let's see some ID." Marcus reached slowly for his wallet, explaining, "I have my school ID and my research center credentials." "Hands where I can see them." Bennett's voice raised an octave. "Step away from the backpack." "Officer, please, I'm just trying to show you my..." Everything happened too quickly after that. A second cruiser arrived, lights flashing. Marcus found himself face down on the sidewalk, cold metal cuffs biting into his wrists. His backpack was roughly searched, his precious notebook tossed carelessly aside. "Look what we have here," Bennett announced, flipping through the notebook's pages. "Some kind of code, formulas. Could be drug calculations." "That's my research." Marcus protested. "Please be careful with it, it's a year's worth of work. Save it for the judge, kid." Bennett's tone dripped with derision. "You can explain why you're carrying around suspicious materials in a restricted area." As they loaded him into the cruiser, Marcus caught a glimpse of Dr. Chen running from the building, calling his name. But the doors slammed shut, and the world he'd worked so hard to build began crumbling around him. In the holding cell that night, Marcus thought about his mother, working her night shift at the hospital, unaware that her son sat behind bars. He thought about his father, who taught him to hold his head high no matter what. Most of all, he thought about his research, the promising results he'd observed just hours ago, now dismissed as potential drug formulas by someone who couldn't see past the color of his skin. The fluorescent lights of Courtroom 7B hummed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the proceedings below. Marcus sat straight-backed beside his court-appointed attorney, David Mills, a harried public defender who'd spent exactly 12 minutes reviewing his case before the hearing. In the gallery behind him, his mother Elena Thompson perched anxiously on the edge of the wooden bench, still wearing her nurse's scrubs from her overnight shift. Docket number 2025, CR 4891, Commonwealth vs. Marcus Thompson, the court officer announced. Charges are trespassing, resisting arrest, and possession of suspicious materials with intent to distribute. Judge Elena Rodriguez peered over her reading glasses at the charging document, her expression unreadable. At 58, she'd earned a reputation for fairness and attention to detail, though few defendants ever noticed the slight softening of her eyes when she dealt with juvenile cases. Assistant District Attorney James Morrison rose, straightening his expensive tie. Your Honor, the Commonwealth has serious concerns about this case. The defendant was apprehended in a high-value target area known for recent break-ins. When confronted by law enforcement, he became confrontational and attempted to reach for an unidentified object. That's not true. Marcus's outburst earned him a sharp look from his attorney and a warning glance from the judge. The defendant continues to display a lack of respect for authority, Morrison continued, sharing a knowing look with Officer Bennett, who stood at the prosecutor's table in her crisp uniform. Furthermore, we discovered materials consistent with drug trafficking operations. Objection, Your Honor. Mills finally spoke up. The material in question is a scientific research notebook. My client is a student researcher at Hamilton Center. A barely suppressed laugh from Officer Bennett drew Judge Rodriguez's attention. The officer quickly composed her face, but not before the judge noticed the exchange of amused glances with Morrison. Something funny, Officer Bennett? Judge Rodriguez's tone could have frozen hell. No, Your Honor. Bennett struggled to maintain a serious expression. It's just, well, the defendant's story is rather creative. A high school student doing cancer research. In that neighborhood. Elena Thompson stood suddenly. My son has a 4.0 GPA and was accepted into Hamilton's competitive research program. If you'd bother to check. Mrs. Thompson, the judge interrupted gently, please be seated. We'll get to all the facts. She turned her attention back to the prosecution. Mr. Morrison, what is the Commonwealth's recommendation for bail? Given the serious nature of the charges and the defendant's attitude, we recommend $50,000 cash bail. A small gasp escaped Elena Thompson. Even on a nurse's salary, that amount was impossible. Judge Rodriguez studied the paperwork before her, then looked directly at Marcus. Something in his dignified bearing, despite the orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, caught her attention. Mr. Thompson, she addressed him directly, would you like to say something about these charges? Marcus stood slowly, aware of every eye in the courtroom. Your Honor, I've worked at Hamilton Center for over a year, studying potential treatments for lymphoma, the cancer that took my father. Everything in my notebook is legitimate research data. Dr. Sarah Chen is my supervisor, she saw the arrest and can verify everything. Oh, this is rich, Morrison muttered, not quite under his breath. Officer Bennett's shoulders shook with poorly concealed mirth. Judge Rodriguez's gavel cracked like a gunshot. Mr. Morrison, Officer Bennett, approached the bench. Now. The courtroom fell silent as the judge spoke in low, intense tones to the two officials. Morrison's smirk gradually faded, and Bennett's face grew progressively redder. Returning to their places, both seemed substantially subdued as Judge Rodriguez addressed the court. I'm setting bail at $500, personal recognizance, she announced. Furthermore, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into the circumstances of this arrest. Mr. Morrison, I expect a detailed report on my desk by tomorrow morning, including verification of Mr. Thompson's status at Hamilton Center. She paused, surveying the courtroom. And let me be very clear, this court takes its duty to seek justice seriously. Any further displays of unprofessional behavior will be dealt with severely. As the handcuffs were removed, Marcus caught a glimpse of a new figure entering the courtroom, Michael Chen, Hamilton Center's legal counsel, striding purposefully toward his mother. For the first time since his arrest, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps someone would finally listen to his side of the story. But as Officer Bennett passed his table, he heard her whisper, "This isn't over, kid." Not by a long shot. Marcus squared his shoulders, remembering his father's words, "Your dignity is not theirs to take." Whatever came next, he would face it with the same determination that drove his research, the search for truth, no matter how difficult the path. The fluorescent lights of Hamilton Center's conference room cast harsh shadows across Michael Chen's face as he spread the documents across the table. Marcus sat beside his mother, both still exhausted from the previous day's ordeal. Dr. Sarah Chen paced near the window, her usually calm demeanor betraying signs of agitation. "Let me get this straight," Michael Chen said, reviewing his notes. "You've been conducting research on a novel approach to lymphoma treatment, specifically focusing on protein markers that could lead to early detection?" Marcus nodded, his hands instinctively reaching for his missing notebook. The preliminary results were promising. We'd identified a potential biomarker that could signal lymphoma development months before current detection methods. A 17-year-old making that kind of breakthrough? Michael raised an eyebrow, not skeptically but with growing interest. Dr. Chen stopped pacing. Marcus isn't just any 17-year-old. His understanding of cellular biology rivals that of my graduate students. But more importantly, he has something they don't, a personal connection that drives him to see patterns others might miss. Marcus's mind drifted to that terrible night 2 years ago, when his father's seemingly minor symptoms had suddenly spiraled into a devastating diagnosis. Too late, the doctors had said. If only they'd caught it sooner. "The notebook," Marcus said quietly. "Everything's in there, a year's worth of observations, data analysis, theoretical frameworks. Officer Bennett has it, and she thinks it's some kind of drug ledger." Elena Thompson reached for her son's hand. "We can request it back, can't we? It's crucial evidence that Marcus is telling the truth." Michael's expression darkened. "It's not that simple. They're holding it as evidence in an ongoing investigation." "But..." He paused, thinking. "Dr. Chen, would you be willing to testify about Marcus's work here?" "Of course," she replied without hesitation. "I've been documenting his progress since he started. We have lab access records, research proposals, even video footage of his presentations to the board." Marcus straightened in his chair. "The quarterly review presentation. It was recorded just last week. I explained everything about the new protein markers we found." Michael began making notes rapidly. "This is good. Very good. But Marcus, I need you to tell me everything about the day of your arrest. Every detail matters." As Marcus recounted the events, his voice caught when he described Officer Bennett's reaction to his research explanation. She didn't even try to understand. She just laughed, like the very idea of me being a scientist was some kind of joke. "Because it didn't fit her narrative," Michael said grimly. "But her prejudice might be her undoing." "Dr. Chen, do you have security footage from that evening?" "Yes, and it shows Marcus leaving at his usual time, carrying his backpack and notebook. It should also show me running out when I heard the commotion." A knock at the door interrupted them. A young intern entered, carrying a thick file. "Mr. Chen, I found those incident reports you requested." Michael took the file, scanning its contents with growing intensity. "Just as I suspected. There's been a pattern of similar stops in this area, predominantly targeting young people of color. But none of the previous cases had such clear documentation of the subject's legitimate presence." Elena's nurse training showed in her methodical questioning. "How do we prove Marcus's notebook contains research and not what they claim?" "We have the previous versions," Dr. Chen said suddenly. "Marcus keeps his old notebooks in the lab. They show the progression of his research, including the ideas that led to his recent breakthrough." Marcus's eyes widened. The day before my arrest, I was reviewing some of Dad's old medical records, comparing the progression markers. I think I found something in the protein patterns that nobody noticed before. Michael leaned forward. Tell me more. As Marcus explained the technical details, his voice grew stronger, more confident. He described how his father's early blood work had shown subtle anomalies months before his diagnosis, patterns that current screening protocols weren't designed to detect. That's why this research matters so much, Marcus concluded. If we can identify these markers early enough, other families won't have to go through what we did. The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Michael Chen closed his notebook slowly. Marcus, he said, I want you to tell this story exactly as you just told it to me. Not just the scientific facts, but the human truth behind them. Let them try to laugh at that. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of depositions, document reviews, and strategy sessions. Michael Chen's office at the downtown legal center became a command center, its walls covered with timeline charts and case precedents. Another one, his assistant announced, dropping a file on his desk. 3rd Precinct, last year. African-American high school student stopped while walking home from chess club. Officer Bennett was the responding officer. Michael added the incident to his growing timeline. A pattern was emerging, one that couldn't be ignored. Across town, Dr. Chen was conducting her own investigation. She'd assembled a panel of leading oncologists to review Marcus's research independently. It's remarkable, Dr. James Wilson, head of oncology at City General, commented as he studied the data. The correlation between these early protein markers and later lymphoma development, it's not just theoretical. This could revolutionize early detection. And this was developed by a high school student, another doctor asked. A high school student who watched his father die because we couldn't catch it in time, Dr. Chen replied quietly. Sometimes the greatest insights come from those with the most at stake. Meanwhile, Elena Thompson had been rallying support within the medical community. Her colleagues at the hospital, many of whom had treated Marcus's father, were outraged by the situation. We've known Marcus since he was a child, Dr. Maria Santos, the chief of medicine, declared. He practically grew up in these halls, always asking questions, always wanting to understand more. The idea that he would be involved in drug trafficking is absurd. But not everyone was eager to help. Several researchers at Hamilton Center, though sympathetic, feared repercussions from law enforcement. Others worried about the center's funding if they became embroiled in controversy. I'm sorry, one senior researcher told Dr. Chen. I want to help, but my grant review is coming up. I can't risk it. Michael Chen wasn't surprised by the resistance. Fear perpetuates injustice, he explained to Marcus during a preparation session. People convince themselves that staying quiet is the safe choice. Like the doctors who saw those early markers in Dad's blood work but didn't investigate further because it didn't fit the standard protocol. Marcus asked. Michael paused, struck by the parallel. Exactly. Sometimes the system itself becomes an obstacle to truth. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A junior officer at the precinct, troubled by what she'd witnessed, anonymously provided records of Officer Bennett's arrest history. Look at this, Michael said, spreading the documents across his desk. Over the past 3 years, Bennett has made 47 arrests in the research district. 42 of them involved young people of color. Of those, 38 cases were dismissed for lack of evidence. But nobody connected the pattern before? Elena asked. Nobody was looking, Michael replied. Each case was handled separately, each dismissal filed away and forgotten. But now we have the full picture. As the evidence mounted, so did support for Marcus. Dr. Chen's panel of oncologists prepared a detailed report on the validity and potential impact of his research. Medical students at the university organized a petition demanding the return of his notebook. Local science teachers wrote letters testifying to his character and achievements. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected quarter. Late one evening, as Michael was reviewing case files, he received a call from a nurse at City General. You need to see this, she said. I was going through some old records, and I found something. Officer Bennett's daughter was treated here last year, for early-stage lymphoma. Michael sat up straighter. Was she part of any research protocols? No, the nurse replied. That's just it. The cancer was caught by chance during a routine physical. If they'd had access to better early detection methods, the implications were staggering. Michael looked at his wall of evidence with new eyes. The case was no longer just about proving Marcus's innocence, it was about showing how prejudice and fear could blind people to the very help they needed most. As he prepared for the upcoming hearings, Michael added one more document to his filing, a research paper published 20 years ago about the importance of diverse perspectives in medical research. The author, Judge Elena Rodriguez, who had written it during her time as a law professor. The pieces were falling into place. Now they just had to make the court, and Officer Bennett, see the truth that had been there all along. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Dr. Sarah Chen took the witness stand. Morning light filtered through the high windows, casting a golden glow that seemed to highlight the stark contrast between the two sides of the courtroom. Marcus sat beside Michael Chen, while Officer Bennett and ADA Morrison whispered urgently at the prosecution table. Dr. Chen, Michael began, please state your credentials for the court. I hold a PhD in molecular biology from Stanford University, and I'm currently the Director of Oncological Research at Hamilton Center. I've published over 40 peer-reviewed papers on cancer detection and treatment protocols. And how do you know the defendant, Marcus Thompson? Dr. Chen's eyes found Marcus in the crowd. Marcus joined our research program last year. Out of hundreds of applicants, his proposal stood out not just for its scientific merit, but for its innovative approach to early cancer detection. ADA Morrison stood. Objection, Your Honor. The witness is offering opinions about the defendant's character. I'm establishing the witness's direct knowledge of the defendant's legitimate presence at Hamilton Center, Michael countered. Overruled, Judge Rodriguez said. Continue, Dr. Chen. Marcus's research focused on identifying novel protein markers that appear in blood samples months before current detection methods can identify lymphoma. Dr. Chen leaned forward. In the past year, he's made discoveries that my senior researchers missed. Michael approached with a thick binder. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into Evidence Exhibit C, containing Marcus Thompson's previous research notebooks, all properly dated and witnessed by Hamilton Center staff. As Michael passed the binder to Judge Rodriguez, he continued, Dr. Chen, could you explain the significance of Marcus's recent findings? The notebook currently being held as evidence contains data suggesting we could detect lymphoma up to 8 months earlier than current methods allow. This could save thousands of lives. The courtroom stirred. Officer Bennett shifted uncomfortably in her seat. And this research was conducted legitimately at Hamilton Center? Yes. We have security footage, badge access logs, and witness statements confirming Marcus's regular presence and work schedule. Michael nodded. Your Honor, I'd like to play Exhibit D, a video recording of Marcus's quarterly review presentation from the week before his arrest. The lights dimmed as a screen descended. Marcus appeared, standing confidently before a panel of scientists, explaining complex molecular pathways with the ease of a seasoned researcher. The recording showed him fielding difficult questions, demonstrating not just knowledge but deep understanding. When the lights came up, Officer Bennett's face had lost some of its certainty. Judge Rodriguez was studying her intently. One final question, Dr. Chen, Michael said. In your professional opinion, what would be the impact of losing the research data contained in Marcus's confiscated notebook? Objection. Morrison stood again. Speculation. I'll allow it, Judge Rodriguez ruled. Answer the question, Dr. Chen. That notebook contains months of irreplaceable observations and analyses. Losing it would set our research back significantly, potentially delaying the development of life-saving early detection methods by years. As Dr. Chen stepped down, Michael called his next witness, Dr. James Wilson, the oncologist who had reviewed Marcus's research. Dr. Wilson, you've treated thousands of lymphoma patients. How many could have been saved by earlier detection? Based on our statistics, approximately 60% of fatal cases might have had different outcomes with earlier intervention. He paused, his voice growing softer. including, I believe, Marcus's father. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. In that moment, the case stopped being about a suspicious notebook or an arrest in an affluent neighborhood. It became about lives that could be saved or lost based on whether people could see past their preconceptions to recognize the truth before them. The next day dawned with a different energy in Courtroom 7B. The gallery was packed, with medical professionals and researchers sitting shoulder to shoulder with community members and activists. Elena Thompson sat in the front row, her nurse's uniform crisp despite her overnight shift. Michael Chen rose to address the court. Your Honor, the defense calls Marcus Thompson. Marcus walked to the witness stand, his head high. He'd spent hours preparing for this moment, but nothing could fully prepare him for the weight of all those eyes upon him. Marcus, Michael began gently, please tell the court about your father. James Thompson was a high school science teacher, Marcus said, his voice steady. He loved explaining complex ideas in ways anyone could understand. When he was diagnosed with lymphoma, he turned his own illness into a teaching opportunity. He kept detailed notes about his symptoms, his treatments, everything. And this influenced your interest in medical research? Yes. After he died, I studied his notes. I noticed patterns in his early blood work that nobody had investigated. That's when I realized, sometimes the answers are there, but we need new ways of looking at them. Michael nodded. Walk us through the evening of your arrest. Marcus described his work that day, the promising results he'd observed, and his walk toward the bus stop. As he recounted Officer Bennett's reaction to his explanation, his voice remained measured. She didn't just dismiss me, Marcus said. She laughed at the very idea that I could be a researcher. She didn't even check my ID or call the center to verify my story. Objection. Morrison interrupted. The defendant is characterizing the officer's state of mind. Overruled, Judge Rodriguez said firmly. Continue, Mr. Thompson. The hardest part wasn't being arrested, Marcus continued. It was watching a year's worth of research being treated like evidence of a crime. That notebook doesn't just contain data, it contains hope for families like mine. Michael produced a stack of documents. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence these police records showing a pattern of similar stops in the research district. Objection. These records aren't relevant to this specific case. They go directly to establishing a pattern of conduct, Your Honor, Michael argued. The court cannot ignore the context in which this arrest occurred. Judge Rodriguez studied the documents. I'll allow it. Proceed, Mr. Chen. Marcus, how has this experience affected your research? Every day without my notebook is another day families like mine move closer to a diagnosis that might come too late. Marcus looked directly at Officer Bennett. I don't want anyone else to lose a parent because we failed to see what was right in front of us. The officer's face had grown pale. For the first time, she seemed to be truly seeing the young man before her, not just her assumptions about him. Michael turned to address the entire courtroom. This case is about more than one arrest or one notebook. It's about the cost of prejudice, not just to its immediate victims, but to society as a whole. How many breakthrough discoveries have we missed because we couldn't see past our preconceptions? How many Marcus Thompsons have been dismissed, deterred, or detained simply for being in places where they didn't belong? He paused, letting the questions hang in the air. The defense would like to call one final witness, Lauren Bennett, Officer Bennett's 16-year-old daughter. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Officer Bennett's sharp intake of breath was audible in the sudden chaos. Approach the bench, Judge Rodriguez ordered. As the attorneys gathered before her, Michael spoke quietly but firmly. Your Honor, Lauren Bennett is a lymphoma survivor. Her cancer was discovered by chance. She represents exactly the kind of person Marcus's research could help. Judge Rodriguez looked at Morrison, then at Officer Bennett, whose face had lost all color. I'll allow it. But tread carefully, Mr. Chen. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone in that courtroom to examine their own prejudices and the true cost of justice delayed. Lauren Bennett walked to the witness stand with the careful steps of someone who had spent too much time in hospitals. At 16, she bore a striking resemblance to her mother, but her eyes held a wisdom beyond her years. Officer Bennett watched her daughter's approach with a mixture of fear and protective instinct. "Lauren," Michael began gently, "please tell the court about your diagnosis." "It was last year," Lauren said, her voice soft but clear. "They found it during a routine physical. I'd been feeling tired, but everyone thought it was just stress from school. If they hadn't done those extra blood tests by chance." She trailed off. "And what was the diagnosis?" "Stage 2 Hodgkin's lymphoma." Lauren's eyes found Marcus across the courtroom. "The same type that killed your dad." "I'm so sorry." Marcus nodded, his own eyes glistening with unexpected tears. "How are you doing now?" Michael asked. "I'm in remission. But every checkup, every blood test, we're always worried it might come back. The doctors say early detection is crucial if it does." Michael approached with a document. "Your Honor, this is Lauren's medical history, which her mother provided during discovery. I'd like to draw attention to her early blood work." He turned back to Lauren. "Did you know that your blood tests from 6 months before your diagnosis showed similar patterns to those Marcus Thompson has been researching?" Objection. Morrison stood. Counsel is leading the witness with scientific conclusions. "Your Honor," Michael countered, "I have an affidavit from Dr. Wilson comparing Lauren's early blood work with the patterns identified in Marcus's research." Judge Rodriguez studied the documents. "I'll allow it. The witness may answer." "No," Lauren said, looking at her mother. "I didn't know that." "Nobody did." "Lauren," Michael continued softly, "what went through your mind when you learned about Marcus's research?" She straightened in her chair. "I thought about other kids like me, whose cancer might be caught earlier. I thought about how scared my mom was when I was diagnosed." Lauren's voice grew stronger. "And I thought about how wrong it is that someone trying to help people like me was treated like a criminal because of how he looks." Officer Bennett's facade cracked. A single tear rolled down her cheek. "One final question," Michael said. "If Marcus's research proves successful, how might it affect other families facing lymphoma?" "It would give them what every cancer patient needs most: time. Time to fight, time to hope." Lauren looked directly at her mother. "Time to live." As Lauren stepped down, she paused beside Marcus. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up." The courtroom sat in stunned silence as Michael called his next witness, Elena Thompson. Marcus's mother took the stand with the quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout the ordeal. Her nurse's uniform seemed to emphasize the parallels between her son's work and her own dedication to healing. "Mrs. Thompson," Michael began, "please tell us about your husband's battle with lymphoma." James started feeling tired in January. By March, he had a persistent cough. But he was a teacher, everyone gets sick at school. She paused, collecting herself. By the time they diagnosed the lymphoma in June, it was too late. "We lost him in August." "And how did Marcus respond to his father's illness?" "He spent every moment he could learning about the disease." James turned their conversations into science lessons, even from his hospital bed. "After we lost him, Marcus threw himself into research. He said if he couldn't save his dad, maybe he could help save someone else's." Michael nodded. "What went through your mind when you learned of your son's arrest?" "Fear, at first," Elena admitted. "Every black parent knows that fear. But then anger. Not just at how they treated him, but at how they dismissed everything he's worked for, everything he's trying to accomplish." She turned to face Officer Bennett directly. "My son could have let grief destroy him. Instead, he channeled it into something that could help people, even people who might never give him a chance if they passed him on the street." The morning of final arguments dawned with unexpected tension. Officer Bennett had requested to address the court, a move that surprised both prosecution and defense. "Your Honor," Morrison protested, "this is highly irregular at this stage of proceedings." "So noted," Judge Rodriguez replied. "However, given the unique circumstances of this case, I'm going to allow it." She turned to Officer Bennett. "Officer, you may proceed." Sarah Bennett approached the witness stand, her uniform impeccable but her usual confidence absent. She took the oath with trembling hands. 19 years on the force, she began, her voice barely steady. I've made thousands of stops, hundreds of arrests. I told myself I was protecting people, keeping neighborhoods safe. She paused, looking at her daughter. I never thought I might be standing in the way of something that could save my own child. The courtroom held its breath as she continued. When I saw Marcus that evening, I didn't see a researcher. I didn't see a son who lost his father to cancer. I didn't see a brilliant young mind trying to make a difference. Her voice cracked. I saw what I expected to see in that neighborhood, because it was easier than questioning my own assumptions. She turned to face Marcus directly. Your notebook. I read it that night, trying to prove it was evidence of a crime. But I didn't understand the formulas, the careful observations, the connections you made. It's still in my desk. I couldn't file it into evidence because deep down, I knew I was wrong. Morrison stood. Your Honor, I must advise my witness. Sit down, Mr. Morrison, Judge Rodriguez ordered. Continue, Officer Bennett. I've spent the past week reviewing my arrest records, really reviewing them. How many other Marcus Thompsons have I stopped? How many dreams have I interrupted? How many breakthroughs have been delayed because someone like me couldn't see past their own prejudices? She reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a worn leather notebook. This belongs to you, Marcus. Your research, your father's legacy, your gift to families like mine. I'm so sorry. The notebook passed from hand to hand until it reached Marcus, who held it like a precious thing returned from the dead. Michael Chin stood. Your Honor, in light of Officer Bennett's testimony, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges. Mr. Morrison. Judge Rodriguez prompted. The prosecutor stood slowly. The Commonwealth withdraws all charges, Your Honor. But Officer Bennett wasn't finished. There's more, Your Honor. I've submitted a formal request to the department for a review of all my arrests in the research district. And I'm requesting assignment to a new community outreach program, working with young people interested in science and medicine. She turned to Marcus one final time. Your father taught science to help students see the world in new ways. Maybe it's time I learned that lesson too. Judge Rodriguez surveyed the courtroom, her eyes lingering on Marcus, on Lauren, on the notebook that had sparked this transformation. Before I render my final decision, she said, I have a question for Mr. Thompson. She looked directly at Marcus. What do you plan to do now? Marcus stood, holding his father's notebook. Continue my research, Your Honor. There are still patterns to find, lives to save. He glanced at Lauren Bennett. And now I know even more why it matters. The judge nodded, a rare smile touching her lips. Then let's make sure you have every opportunity to do just that. 3 months after the dismissal of charges, the Hamilton Research Center's main auditorium was filled to capacity. The occasion was the inaugural address of the James Thompson Initiative for Early Disease Detection, named in honor of Marcus's father. The audience represented a cross-section of the community, medical researchers, police officers, community leaders, and families affected by cancer. Marcus stood at the podium, no longer the accused teenager but a young scientist coming into his own. His mother sat in the front row, beside Dr. Sarah Chen and, surprisingly, Officer Sarah Bennett and her daughter Lauren. My father used to say that the greatest discoveries come from asking questions nobody else thought to ask, Marcus began. But he also taught me that those questions can only lead to answers when people are willing to listen. He gestured to the screen behind him, where complex molecular diagrams illustrated his research findings. In the past 3 months, our team has validated the early detection markers we identified. Clinical trials will begin next month at 5 major hospitals. But this initiative isn't just about medical research. Marcus turned to where Officer Bennett sat. It's about breaking down the barriers that keep us from seeing each other's humanity. It's about recognizing that progress depends on our ability to look past our preconceptions. The officer nodded slightly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She wore civilian clothes now, having taken a temporary leave from patrol duty to help establish the department's new community science engagement program. Thanks to generous funding from the National Cancer Institute and private donors, Marcus continued, we're expanding our research program to include high school students from underserved communities. Every participant will be provided with proper identification and documentation to ensure they can pursue their research without fear of harassment or arrest. In the audience, Judge Elena Rodriguez smiled. Her strongly worded decision in Marcus's case had led to departmental reforms in police procedures and community engagement. But more importantly, it had sparked a broader conversation about systemic barriers in scientific research. We've also established a partnership with the police department, Marcus announced. Officers will receive training about the various research programs in their patrol areas, and regular community forums will bring together law enforcement, researchers, and residents to build understanding. He paused, looking down at his father's notebook, which now occupied a place of honor in the research center's archive. But perhaps the most significant development is this: last week, our preliminary research paper was accepted for publication in the Journal of Clinical Oncology. The peer reviewers specifically noted that our unique perspective on early detection markers might never have been discovered without bringing diverse viewpoints into medical research. Elena Thompson wiped away tears as applause filled the auditorium. Beside her, Lauren Bennett reached over to squeeze her hand, a gesture of solidarity between two families forever changed by lymphoma and justice. After the ceremony, Officer Bennett approached Marcus. The first group of officers starts their science orientation next week, she said. Would you be willing to speak to them? Of course, Marcus replied. Dad always said the best way to change minds is to share knowledge. Dr. Chen joined them, holding a stack of papers. The initial screening protocols based on your research will be implemented at City General next month. Lauren, would you consider being one of our first volunteer participants for the long-term monitoring program? Lauren nodded eagerly. Mom and I both want to help. Maybe our experience can help convince other families to participate in the trials. As the groups mingled and talked, Judge Rodriguez observed from the back of the room. In her 30 years on the bench, she'd seen countless cases where justice seemed to be at odds with humanity. But sometimes, she reflected, true justice meant allowing humanity to triumph over prejudice. 1 year later, the changes sparked by Marcus Thompson's case had rippled far beyond the original courtroom drama. The morning sun streamed through the windows of City General's new early detection center, where Marcus, now a freshman pre-med student at the State University, was explaining the screening process to a group of visiting high school students. The key was looking at protein patterns we'd previously ignored, he told them, pointing to a complex diagnostic readout. Sometimes the most important discoveries are hidden in plain sight, we just need the courage to question established assumptions. Among the students was Officer Bennett's daughter Lauren, now celebrating 18 months in remission. She'd become a passionate advocate for the screening program, sharing her story with other young patients and their families. Across town, in the police academy's new community education center, Officer Bennett was conducting a training session for rookie officers. The walls displayed photos of local research facilities and their staff, part of an initiative to help officers recognize and support legitimate scientific work in their patrol areas. Your job isn't just to protect and serve, she told the cadets. It's to understand and support the communities you serve. That means checking your assumptions and being willing to learn from your mistakes. In her office at the courthouse, Judge Rodriguez reviewed the latest statistics. Complaints of racial profiling in the research district had dropped by 60%. More significantly, participation in scientific programs by minority students had increased dramatically, thanks to the new identification and support systems put in place. The judge's phone rang. It was Michael Chen, now heading a nonprofit organization dedicated to breaking down barriers in scientific research. The Thompson Initiative is being adopted by research centers in 3 other states, he reported. And Marcus's follow-up paper on early detection methods is being hailed as a breakthrough in preventive oncology. And how's our young scientist doing? The judge asked. Thriving. He's maintaining a perfect GPA while continuing his research. Several medical schools are already expressing interest. Later that evening, at a community dinner celebrating the first anniversary of the James Thompson Initiative, Marcus stood to address the gathered families, researchers, and officers. A year ago, I thought I'd lost everything, he began. My research, my dreams, maybe even my freedom. But what could have been an ending became a beginning, not just for me, but for all of us. He gestured to where Officer Bennett sat with her daughter. We learned that justice isn't just about proving innocence or guilt. It's about recognizing the potential in every person, about giving everyone the chance to contribute to the greater good. Elena Thompson watched her son with pride, remembering her husband's words, "Our boy sees the world differently, that's his gift to us all." Marcus continued, his voice strong and clear. The early detection program has already identified 12 cases of lymphoma in its preliminary stages. That's 12 families who have time to fight, time to hope, time to live. He held up his father's notebook, its pages now digitized and shared with research centers across the country. This is my father's legacy, the understanding that every question deserves to be asked, every person deserves to be heard, and every life deserves to be saved. As the applause filled the room, Dr. Chen leaned over to Elena. James would be so proud. He is, Elena replied softly. Every time Marcus helps another family, every time he breaks down another barrier, his father's spirit lives on. The evening ended with an announcement that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The police department and Hamilton Center were establishing a joint scholarship program for minority students interested in medical research. The first recipient would be chosen by a committee co-chaired by Officer Bennett and Marcus Thompson. As the guests departed, Judge Rodriguez lingered to watch Marcus speaking animatedly with a group of young students, his enthusiasm for science as infectious as ever. She thought about how close they'd come to losing this bright light to prejudice and fear. Sometimes, she mused to Michael Chen, justice wears a lab coat instead of a blindfold. And sometimes, he replied, it takes a 17-year-old to teach us all how to see. The story of Marcus Thompson had begun with laughter in a courtroom. It ended with something far more powerful, hope in a community forever changed by the courage to look past appearances and see the truth that lay beneath. In a world where snap judgments can alter destinies, Marcus's story reminds us that behind every face lies a story waiting to be heard, behind every prejudice lies an opportunity for understanding, and within every challenge lies the seed of transformation. This isn't just a story about a courtroom battle or scientific discovery, it's a mirror reflecting our own biases, assumptions, and the power we hold to change them. It shows us that true justice isn't about winning or losing, it's about growing, learning, and recognizing the potential in every human being. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, how many Marcus Thompsons walk among us, their brilliance dimmed by our preconceptions? How many breakthroughs have we missed because we couldn't see past our biases? The power to change this reality lies in our hands, in our willingness to look deeper, listen harder, and stand up for what's right. If this story touched your heart and opened your mind, help us spread its message. Like this video to show your support for storytelling that matters, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that challenge perspectives and inspire change. Together, we can build a world where justice sees with the heart, where potential isn't limited by prejudice, and where every voice has the chance to be heard. Hit that subscribe button now, because every story of transformation begins with someone willing to listen.